Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I actually knew the bloody camera was there the entire time, and this bloody switch isn't even turned on. I fooled you all. I wasn't playing anything. I was waiting to start this video. Yeah. Anyway, today we are going to be discussing how to get retro games cheap in the year 2017. As you know, things have got pretty expensive these days. Just to touch a little bit on my previous video in which I done on why I hate retro game collectors. To be fair, it got quite a good response in the comment section. Many of you was very grown up and actually seemed to understand my tongue-in-cheek nature of the content. With regards to some of the responses I had, I was quite curious into people's reasons as to why they collect. Especially people who go for complete sets, as who in their right mind wants to pay out loads of money for terrible games? It's just a complete waste of money, isn't it? Because you could just spend that money on more good games from another set instead. So why do you want to waste money on bloody crap games when you can spend that same money on more good games? It's just stupid, isn't it? But anyway, talking to quite a few collectors who go for the full sets, what many of them was telling me, they like to collect full sets for fun, but they set themselves limits on paying out certain amounts. Like, for example, a lot of them, this is just a random ballpark figure, said they would not pay more than €100 for a game. So they're trying to get the complete set of NES games, and they only pay up to a certain amount for each cartridge. The only thing I have to say about that really is they call themselves complete set collectors, which I hear a term I hear thrown around all the time. But is it all pie in the sky really? As in all likelihood they're never going to find a full set for that cheap. So they're mentally going for a full set, but are most of them ever going to physically manage to attain that set? So I can understand it being fun looking for those games, but in reality, is it actually ever going to happen? So yes, to summarise, I suppose, from what my findings from that previous video, is the main reason people go for these full sets is that they simply see it as fun. It's often a compulsion that leads to that. It's often, I suppose, positive reinforcement for actually feeling like they're achieving something from it all. And I suppose also it's a form of comfort buying as well. I suppose it's like the same as when people get really obese from comfort eating. It's exactly the same with having a bloody load of games, I suppose. But still, after all of these findings, I would still never buy shit games over good games. I still find it rather all irrational behaviour, to be honest with you. But yes, moving on to today's topic, for those of you who do want to indulge yourselves in ritualistic behaviour, today I am going to do a nice little video on how to collect games cheap in 2017. Yeah! So, I suppose my genesis as a collector started in 1998, as that would have been the first time I bought any games retrospectively. So essentially we was deep into the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 era at the time, and I chose to buy a Master System and loads of games off of one of my school friends. He just saw it as useless old tat at the time, so I managed to get it off him for £15 so he could just buy a PlayStation game, and then I got a Master System with loads of games. And I had bloody loads of fun with that, because I always wanted Alex Kidd, Sonic the Hedgehog, etc. And it was the first time I ever had a Master System of my own. Fast forward to 2002, when I turned 16 and I had a little bit more money to do things with. So at that point I would start going around the boot sales, and then I was noticing Mega Drive games, NES games, Super Nintendo games, etc. All like 50p to £1 each. There would occasionally be bloody games sellers wanted £2 for. And I'm like, I'm not paying £2 for an old game. That's absolutely preposterous. Why would any idiot ever want to pay £2 for a bloody old game? That's really, really stupid. So I was collecting because it was fun. It was cheap. And it was fun. And more importantly, I was collecting so I could play the games. I'd always wanted a bloody Mega Drive. So I finally had one of my own, and I could play bloody loads of games in it. And it was costing me a bloody £1 per game. It was absolutely awesome. But sadly, those days are long gone, as you would be aware. Since then, we have had the rise of YouTubers, including, I suppose, one of the first ones would have been the Angry Video Game Nerd. To me, it was very surprising at the time that there was other people in the world who was really into collecting games. I was like, wow, I'm not the only one apparently who's strange enough to want to play these old games. But from there, it obviously started to craze. One channel led to the next, which led to the next. And then suddenly you've got the whole of the internet all talking about buying and selling retro games. It wasn't before long that certain games became very expensive. But here's the interesting thing I've noticed. A lot of those content creators are American, I should say. And in America, in the 1980s, Nintendo, as I've said many times, completely monopolised their market. So most American collectors who grew up in the 1980s are absolutely obsessed with the NES. And because of that reason, there's so many people collecting for the NES that it's become a ridiculously expensive system to collect for. The same as the Super Nintendo, because many of them transitioned straight from an NES to a Super Nintendo. So because of that, those particular systems are now really, really expensive. So, because of this, if you want to become a collector today, and you've got any sense whatsoever in that noggin of yours, then you're not going to go near Nintendo games. They have become so overpriced, it's ridiculous. There's no point anyway today. You can bloody emulate basically all of them and play them for bloody free. So there's no point collecting them now. When I was collecting them, it was bloody fun because they was 50p to £1 each. Like, you've got to be a lunatic, haven't you, to want to start a collection now and pay like £30 to £50 for the games I was paying £1 for. That's just stupid, isn't it? But there is an alternative to get your ritualistic collecting fix, and that is to go for the alternative products. Back at home in my country of the United Kingdom, as I've said many times before, we had no video game crash. So therefore, Nintendo never managed to get their big claw around that industry at the time. There was no dominant company. In the mid-80s, like I've said, we had Sinclair, we had Commodore, we had Amstrad, and we had the BBC Micro, which was made by Acorn, and there was just a range of different products people could game on. Now here's the interesting thing. Because none of those were big sensations on the other side of the pond, none of those American YouTubers who have overexposed gaming have really touched upon those platforms that much. So the prices for gaming on all of those has remained as cheap as it was for me to collect for the NES and Super Nintendo back in 2002. You can still collect ridiculous amounts of microcomputer games for 50p to £1 each. So you can get exactly the same experience from collecting for microcomputers what I could get from the Super Nintendo, Mega Drive, etc. in 2002 before it became mainstream and stupid. Strangely enough, actually, around December, January sort of time, I actually bought myself a new Amstrad CPC 464, as that was the microcomputer I grew up with. The only reason I've still not got one is actually because my bloody mother threw it away when we moved house. That was really annoying, actually. Bloody, I saw the Eastern Europeans run off of it in the skip. Bloody annoying, makes me angry to this day, which is why I finally bought another one to cure me from those repressed memories. Anyway, December, January is the best time of year to buy games. It always has been, because everyone's bloody skint from Christmas, so you can get yourself some right bargains. Anyway, over that time period, because Amstrad games are so cheap, I actually bought around 400 games from eBay, I'd say, for the platform, and that only set me back probably about £150. So imagine buying 400 NES games for about $180. It's just not going to happen, is it? But that could have happened, for example, if we're talking about the late 90s. But that's what I'm talking about, the difference between then and now. And microcomputers are just seems to be the way forward if you want to collect, and collect in bulk. What also makes them interesting, as I said, people have not talked about them nowhere near as much online. So all the information about the games has been nowhere near as overexposed. Like collecting for the NES and Super Nintendo, etc. has become pretty boring for me now, as I know everything bloody about them. I've watched so much bloody content, as I assume most of you at home probably have, otherwise you wouldn't be bloody watching a small channel like mine. So you probably know everything there is to know about the NES and the SNES, so you already know which games to emulate, etc. Whereas many of the micro computers may be a little bit of an unknown to you, but we're going to get onto that a little bit now. I hear a lot of the reason many people won't try out the microcomputers is because many of them believe in their heads that the NES just has a much, much better library. Whilst I agree that NES does indeed have a fantastic library of games, when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, it's a little bit of a two-dimensional system. Like I'd say about 95% of the games on the platform are very, very similar. It's basically the side-scrolling machine. Like, nearly every single game on the system are bloody side-scrollers. I know there's obviously some that aren't, but most of them are. They're just variations of the side-scrolling genre. And I think that's what a lot of it is. Certain people have got in their head their perception of retro gaming, and be it side-scrolling or whatever. Like, I'll give you another example. I've got a young cousin called Anthony Darcy who actually watches this channel. He's only 20 years old and he has become a game collector. For him though, he will not touch the NES or microcomputers or anything like that, because for him, he will not basically go for anything older than 16-bit, because he looks at that style of gaming, the NES and the 8-bit, as very primitive. The same way some of you at home who like the NES won't touch the microcomputers because they're too different to what you are used to and what you've grown up with. The microcomputers, on the other hand, you've got a lot more variation in gameplay than you'll find on the NES. Like, absolutely tons more. And a lot more experimentational stuff as well, I would say, because you had a lot of homebrew developers, so you pretty much had constant innovation on those. Another great thing about the microcomputers is that the libraries are so much vaster than that of the NES as well. Like, the NES did very badly in England, so we only ever had 200 games released for the platform. But in the United States, I hear they had around 800 games released. Still, that absolutely pales in comparison to some of my favourite microcomputers. Like the Amstrad, the one I grew up with, that has 1,400 different games to play on it. And if we want to go even more extreme, the ZX Spectrum, 22 bloody thousand games. Now that is what you call a system with like choice and diversity. A lot more than you'll find with just the side-scrollers on the NES. Another key element in which I would say contributes towards wanting to collect from microcomputers is the discovery element involved. I remember back in the day, as I said, when I started collecting for the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo, etc. around the boot sales. The internet was around, obviously, but it was nowhere near as prevalent in people's lives. So when I go around these boot sales and buy these games, it would genuinely be a mystery to me what these games were like. So it would be a surprise putting them in a console and playing them for the first time. It was a great experience. I never knew what I was going to get. That doesn't happen anymore with Nintendo or Sega, etc. We literally are experts on the subjects. We know everything bloody about them. So there's no mystery in buying a game anymore. You'll know exactly what you're going to get. Well, I do anyway, as soon as I put the bloody cartridge in. That's another thing that's great about microcomputers. Because there's so many bloody games, and because it's been far less exposed by the American YouTubers than the NES Mega Drive, etc., you're literally discovering new things all the time. And because you can buy the games in bulk, you're constantly going to have surprises, aren't you? It's going to be like back in the day when you was a kid, putting a new game in the first time, and you don't know what you're going to get. You can bring that entire experience back by gaming on microcomputers. Another quirk I often hear people worrying about when it comes to collecting for micros is the games themselves. Obviously they came on cassettes, like what you put on a Walkman back in the day rather than on a cartridge. And because of that, sometimes they can be susceptible to malfunctioning or no longer working. Whilst you do have that risk to some degree, I would say it's not the biggest thing to worry about in the world, because the games are actually so cheap. If you're buying them in bulk, you're literally looking at paying about 30 pence a game, I'd say. So what's that? About 45 American cents per game. So even if some of them don't work, you haven't really lost anything, because you've paid so bloody little for the games in the first place. It isn't like you've bought a £30 NES game and you're worried about whether that's going to work or not. Because if your microcomputer game's not going to work, you've still bought a big pile and most of them do work. So you just cut your losses, essentially. So that's not something to worry about at all, I suppose. So yes, to touch a little bit, I suppose, on what we call the international market as well, because back at home in my domestic market in the UK, the microcomputers did very well. It may have been less prevalent in other countries, but because of today's ridiculously high Nintendo game prices, Sega game prices, PlayStation game prices, etc., it's probably still well worth your time just bloody importing microcomputer games from England. It's going to cost you significantly less importing the system and loads of games than it is to go to your bloody local retro game shop to buy bloody NES games. You're going to pay much less importing games from a bloody different continent, believe it or not. One more minor complaint I often hear people bring up is the load times on the micros. Apparently, according to many people on the internet, micros take absolutely bloody ages to load games. And if I remember as a child, it did feel like a really long time before I got to play my games. But it turns out that was just me being a stupid, overexcited child. Because on most micros, games take about 5 to 6 minutes to load, which is a significantly shorter amount of time than it takes to boot up a PlayStation 4 or Xbox One game for the first time. So, as I said, it's a little bit of a myth that they take ages, but you do have to wait about 5 minutes. But what's bloody 5 minutes in this day and age? You can just get out an app and play it on your phone for 5 minutes, something like that while you're waiting. So yes, if you want to become a Nintendo, Sega or Sony collector in 2017, then I'm afraid I've got some bad news. That ship has now long sailed away into the sunset, as games are ridiculously expensive. So you'd have to be a bit crazy really to want to purchase games at those prices when I was getting them for £1 a few years back. However, you can still have the great experiences of collecting in which I had by collecting for micros instead. Again, you get the extremely cheap prices I had with Sega and Nintendo back in the day. You get the ridiculously huge libraries of the micros, which is far superior to that of any of the consoles from the time period. And on top of all of that, and the best thing about them of all for me, is the mystique they have. The amount of games they have, and basically none of them have been nowhere near as exposed as the Nintendo games. We already know all the Nintendo games, we know all the Sega games, but you will still be discovering hidden gems on the microcomputers until the day you bloody die. There's just so many games to them. So you'll get to be an explorer and just looking at the hundreds of great games on the platform. So yes, anyway, that is how you become a game collector for cheap in 2017. Ditch the mainstream because it's overexposed and go back to the micros. Yeah! So yes, I would love to hear some of your comments within my comment section about this video. Would you perhaps like to give the microcomputers a try? Or are you a bloody dirty Nintendo fanboy for the rest of your life? Anyway, I'd love to hear from all of you, and I've really enjoyed doing these discussions lately. And another thing I'd like to ask you is, what other subjects would you like to hear me discuss? Because I'm bloody here now, and this has been bloody fun, so give me some bloody topics. I'll click one of these annotations as well, you'll get to see one of my other videos. Watch minutes.